Archbishop Getari, as his title was by the time he died, was among the young people that were involved in the formation of Kenya Student Christian Fellowship. He was a student in Kangaroo and helped start the Christian Union there after he was born again. And he was so hot in the things of God as a student that he's the one who represented them in the first Ksf convention, 1958, at the Otto Teachers College. I think it was then high school. And therefore was involved in the very first meeting that decided we want to form a national student movement to help coordinate the work in Kenya. Since he had finished high school, his next port of call was the nascent, newly established Royal Technical College, which was a university college. And so he became among the first students in that college. And together with another one of the Ksf elders, Joseph Musembi, they became classmates, studying together. At that time, since you've just left Form 4, they used to take 5 years, 2 for A-level, then another 3 in order to make the degree. That way means they stayed in the university right into the 60s. And therefore, again, became like the founders of the Focus movement. Because you see, the first Focus, because it was not called Focus then, the first university student ministry in Kenya, not East Africa, but in Kenya, was in the Royal Technical College, which again Dr. Getari was involved in as a young student. I heard Musembi say that although Musembi was the first chairman in 58, in the 5 years they are there, they kept changing. Sometimes it is Getari who is chairman, sometimes it's Musembi who is chairman, and they were there together. And both of them, after they finished university in the early 60s, must be given 59, 60, 61, 62, 63. It must be 63 when they finally got a degree. And Dr. Getari was posted in Thika High School. And he continued his work in helping to organize the Christian Union. And where he was, at that point, he was among the very few black teachers, because over 90% of the school, and not just Thika High School, but most schools in Kenya, high schools were taught by foreigners, expatriates. And it is from there that he finally got the call to go and work as a student traveling secretary for Africa for the newly formed Pan-African Fellowship of Evangelical Students, all of Africa. Of course, maybe there were just over 10 universities in the whole of Africa. And that's the job he did for some time before finally later moving from the student work and going to study in the Bristol, I think it's Bristol University, and got his Bachelor of Divinity, a second degree, and came back to Kenya to be in Bible Society. Despite the fact that he has come back and become the head of general of Bible Society, his interest in student work continued. And so he was in the KSF work initially after he came back. That must be 1970, 71. As he comes back, he is involved in speaking in student Christian unions meetings, in camps, but in that he soon actually becomes the chairman of Kscf, still in the early 70s, 1970s, and still continuing in Pepper Sati. And Pepper Sati had given him a house in Westlands, and when he realized they are likely to sell it, he suggested to Ksf that the Ksf could buy, which was difficult for the Ksf committee that was struggling paying salaries to actually even imagine. But he encouraged them, and they were able to get a loan, and they finally owned a prime plot, which is still where the Ksf office is up to today as I write this. You can see then there are many, many major things that he was involved in. One of the memorable issues was the kind of confrontation he had with the charismatic renewal. When he came back in 1970, he found that in that turn of the 60s, there was a big charismatic renewal, and I call it charismatic renewal. These are people speaking in tongues. They are not necessarily leaving their former churches, but they believe the spirit-filled life, exactly like it was in the New Testament, is possible today. And that message was going to schools. And having armed himself with a theological degree, he spent quite a bit of time trying to show people how that's not the direction to go. But the tide of the charismatic renewal was overwhelming, and of course soon overran most of the schools and camps. There's always remembered a camp that was at Machakos, where there was an open confrontation between the KSF leaders, some of who were charismatic, and him. And the fact that after the talk, some of those leaders went with students to a prayer room, and people are still getting spirit-filled and speaking in tongues in the same conference where the issues are being raised as to whether the direction we should be allowing the students to go into. And thank God for his maturity. He actually finally started working well with those charismatic people, because it's not only now in KSF, even as he now must be maybe 1975, when he finally left the Bible Society because he had become a young bishop of Mount Kenya East, which is the current 3 dioceses of Kirinyaga, Meru, Embu, all those dioceses were one diocese, because it was called Mount Kenya East. It spread all the way to Ethiopia. And so he, again, even as bishop, he continued being involved in KSF work, and attending and speaking in camps and schools, and being a patron, because then he entered the area of being a patron of the KSF. He still used to raise those issues in the patrons meeting. I can still remember being chairman 1983 to 86, meeting in the patrons, because this was work of the executive once in a while to sit with the patrons. I can still remember him confronting, are we sending Anglican children to high schools, then the KSF is converting them into Pentecostals, or what is happening? What's the role of the executive committee and council in ensuring that is not what is happening? And I remember pointing out to him that whereas in the 1960s, the Pentecostal people were few, today, the students entering, that's when I say today, I mean those are the mid 1980s, the people entering the schools were already, a big majority were charismatic. Their parents are charismatic. So they are not being converted. They are already charismatic. and we can't again change it. And the Ksf must remain non-denominational, non-partisan, and welcome people, whether they are from Pentecostal or Anglican or Methodist. They must actually be welcomed together. So, like I'm saying, he had a level of maturity that allowed him to work with people who didn't necessarily agree with him, but he was also the type of person who told you where he stood. And that helped the Ksf to steer clear of extremism of any nature. As a patron, he helped us to be careful about taking any extremist sides and continuing in the middle ground. So, all his life, from the time he was a teenager to the time he died now in retirement, he continued being involved in KSF, even not many months before he died. He was involved in what we call Pioneers Meeting, where he was one of the chief guests, and we were honoring the people that were over 65 years in age and had been involved in KSF in its first 15 years of life, from 1958, 15 years into it. And we regard those as the pioneers of Kscf, in the founding of KSF. And so he gave a very important talk and was actually interviewed. And the interview record is actually in the archives of KSCF. So we are happy to admit that KSF is what it is, with a huge input of the late bishop, retired Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Kenya. And we are grateful that in his book, his biography, he acknowledges that role that KSF played initially in helping him as a student, and then he himself spent the rest of his life, whatever career, whatever else he is doing, he was always a KSF person and involved in its work. In addition to being involved in the university, in the focus work. And it's our prayer that we who are left behind will continue that legacy of whatever your other involvement, continuing with involvement among students, knowing that the students you spoke to 40 years ago are not the students who are there now. These are the children of those people, and they have not heard you before. They are hearing you for the first time. So there is no time you retire from involvement in ministering to students until God calls you home. The other thing that what are the lessons, as I conclude this, that we can draw as KSF in the life of from the life of the late Archbishop. Number one, that the students you are talking to now, like Gitare in 1958, the teenager in 1958, that the students you are talking to and equipping could be the very future head of a church. Bishop Gitare, if you read his biography, you'll see he was not only having impact in Kenya, but he was a global icon and spoke in conferences right across the globe. And we need to learn that the people we are dealing with, when in front of you, you are seeing a Form 2 boy. But if God would help you, prepare thoroughly, because you have no idea that young Form 2 boy you are talking to may have global impact, like that small boy Gitare was, as he attended the 1958 conference. Number two, that the KSF is really a partner with the churches. So even when churches give money and donate to the secretariat of KSF, they are really investing in themselves. Because these people that are in the Christian Union and serious with God as young people are the type of people that will be very useful in the leadership of the church. And so the second lesson we need to learn from the life of David Gitari is that when you invest in the students, you are actually investing in the future stability and growth of the church. Thirdly and importantly, that you don't have to be a teacher to be involved in Kscf work. He was a teacher that period in the early 1960s, just before we got independence. But he continued and he left teaching. He left teaching very early, but he continued his involvement in Kscf work right even after retirement from the age of 65 from the work of the church. So it means professionals, non-teachers, have a role in Kscf that needs to be recognized and encouraged. Thank you very much.